As the world held its breath from Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939, shockwaves reverberated globally. Within a mere year, France fell to German forces in a lightning-fast campaign that lasted just 6 weeks. The juggernaut of the German war machine seemed unstoppable, leaving destruction in its wake. Yet, amidst the chaos, plans were already in motion for a colossal undertaking: the invasion of one of the world's most resource-rich territories, the Soviet Union. At this time also, the German forces pushed into North Africa. Their panzer division spearheaded the assault, poised for further conquests. However, the march eastward in the Soviet Union would present unforeseen challenges, ones that would transform from mere nuisances into catastrophic setbacks for the blitzkrieg machinery and the German war machine. As a highly advanced industrial nation pre-war, Germany relied very heavily on external sources for an ample supply of oil, even during times of peace. Despite consuming just over 44 million barrels of oil in 1938, far less than Great Britain's 76 million, Russia's 183 million, and the staggering 1 billion consumed by the United States, Germany still found itself needing significant imports to meet its oil demands. During World War II, Germany's dire need for a reliable liquid fuel supply was absolutely indispensable for the success of military operations, whether on the ground or in the air. Germany's oil procurement strategies were multifaceted, relying on 3 primary sources: imports of crude oil from abroad, domestic oil field production, and the synthesis of petroleum products from coal. In the year 1938, out of the total oil consumption of 44 million barrels, a substantial portion, approximately 60%, totaling 28 million barrels, was sourced through imports from overseas. Additionally, 3.8 million barrels were brought in overland from European suppliers, further supplementing the supply chain. Domestic oil production within Germany contributed another 3.8 million barrels to the overall tally. However, the limitations of Germany's natural oil deposits prompted a significant focus on synthetic oil production. With the country's considerable coal reserves, it was deemed logical to explore synthetic methods for producing oil. Both coal and petroleum share hydrocarbon compositions, presenting a promising avenue for conversion. Thus, efforts were directed towards devising efficient methods to extract and transform these hydrocarbons into usable oil, a task vital for sustaining Germany's wartime endeavours. When Hitler rose to power as Chancellor in 1933, Germany was presented with a range of methods to advance its industrial capabilities, some of which were already accessible or in the initial phases of refinement. However, one method stood out as particularly promising: the groundbreaking Fischer-Tropsch process. Developed by German chemists Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch in 1925, this innovative process represented a major leap forward in the production of synthetic fuels. Its potential for enhancing Germany's energy independence and industrial prowess garnered significant attention and investment. Under the Fischer-Tropsch process, coal undergoes compression into gas, which is then mixed with hydrogen through contact ovens and the addition of specific catalysts. This process leads to the formation of molecules that can be further treated to produce fuel, primarily diesel oil. Notably, the Fischer-Tropsch process, and an even more advanced method known as the hydrogenation process, enabled the direct conversion of coal into gasoline. In the 1920s, Germans began exploring alternative fuel sources for several reasons. Firstly, the blockade during World War I highlighted their dependence on imports for various essential raw materials, revealing vulnerabilities. Secondly, following the Lost War and subsequent economic challenges, Germany faced shortages of foreign exchange needed to purchase foreign oil. Thirdly, concerns arose globally about dwindling proven oil reserves, although subsequent discoveries alleviated these worries. However, the second motive, the shortage of foreign exchange, persisted and intensified. Moreover, Hitler's regime was committed to achieving Germany's independence from external sources, particularly in terms of fuel. This determination stemmed from both economic necessity and ideological motivations. In August of 1936, as the strains of rearmament began to take a toll on the German economy, a growing crisis prompted Hitler to take decisive action. He issued the Four-Year Plan Memorandum, a pivotal directive that mandated Hermann Göring to spearhead the implementation of what became known as the Four-Year Plan. This ambitious initiative aimed to rapidly prepare the German economy for the looming spectre of war within the next 4 years. The Four-Year Plan was not merely a singular decree but a comprehensive series of economic measures devised by Hitler himself. It represented a strategic response to the challenges facing Germany, signalling a concerted effort to fortify the nation's economic resilience and readiness for potential conflict. Through this plan, Hitler sought to consolidate and mobilize Germany's resources, industries and workforce to meet the demands of an increasingly militarized agenda, laying the groundwork for the nation's future endeavors on the world stage. Hitler's appointment of Hermann Göring to oversee these measures signalled a consolidation of power that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of various cabinet ministries. Göring's authority spanned economics, defence and agriculture, reflecting the comprehensive nature of the task at hand. At the core of the Four-Year Plan lay a dual mission to facilitate Germany's rapid rearmament and to position the nation for self-sufficiency within the designated time frame of 1936 to 1940. As Germany increasingly geared its focus towards the imperatives of a wartime economy, the urgency surrounding preparedness became ever more palpable. By 1938, these concerns had evolved into central pillars of Germany's national strategy. Prior to this pivotal period, significant investments had been made in hydrogenation plants across central Germany. In 1937 alone, these facilities yielded a substantial output of 4.8 million barrels of diverse petroleum fuels. Yet, as the geopolitical landscape continued to shift, so too did Germany's production goals. In the summer of 1938, Göring initiated a new phase of the program, recalibrating objectives to align with the overarching ambition of achieving complete rearmament by 1942. This strategic realignment underscored Germany's unwavering commitment to military readiness and economic autonomy in the face of mounting challenges on the horizon. The escalating demands of armament production necessitated a significant expansion in fuel resources, a challenge that became evident with the introduction of the revised Economic Production Plan of 1938. Spearheaded by Göring, this updated plan set forth ambitious targets, aiming to produce nearly 88 million barrels of various fuels and lubricants by the year 1942. However, the realization of these ambitious goals was hindered by practical limitations. The sheer magnitude of the program required steel quantities that outstripped the capacity of the existing economy to provide. Shortages in both steel and manpower hampered the timely completion of fuel construction projects. At the outbreak of war, while 7 plants were operational, 3 were in advanced stages of construction and 2 had just commenced. Even as efforts were made to expedite construction, progress fell short of initial projections. Delays were compounded by intense competition for essential raw materials, many of which were diverted towards armament production. Furthermore, overly optimistic forecasts by the High Command exacerbated these challenges, leaving Germany ill-prepared for the demands of wartime production. Despite these setbacks, the output of synthetic fuel experienced notable growth between 1938 and 1943, increasing from 10 million barrels to 36 million barrels. Consequently, the proportion of synthetic fuels in the overall fuel supply surged from 22% to over 50% by 1943. This shift underscored Germany's strategic pivot towards synthetic fuel production, highlighting its pivotal role in compensating for deficiencies in traditional fuel resources. Germany's perspective on synthetic petroleum was intriguing, viewing it as a means to utilize its abundant organic coal reserves to reduce dependence on foreign imports while simultaneously meeting the escalating demand for fuel. Coal served as the backbone of the German economy, constituting 90% of the nation's energy consumption by 1937. German mines boasted advanced mechanization, enabling them to outpace European counterparts in production efficiency. For instance, in 1938, German coal output per man-hour exceeded that of Great Britain by a third and doubled that of France and Belgium. Between 1938 and 1939, Germany produced 187.5 million tons of coal, a figure that increased steadily until 1944, reaching a peak of 268.9 million tons. This surge was partly attributed to acquisitions of coal-rich territories in Czechoslovakia and Poland during the early stages of the war. However, Germany also managed to augment its domestic coal production, albeit modestly, in response to the growing demands of synthetic fuel and steel manufacturing. This strategic approach underscores Germany's concerted efforts to leverage its domestic resources to fuel its wartime industrial ambitions. In 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact seemed to solidify a sense of stability in Europe, as Hitler and Stalin agreed to a mutual non-aggression pact, effectively dividing the continent. However, behind this facade of peace, oil emerged as a decisive factor that would ultimately rupture this fragile agreement and propel Hitler towards war with the Soviet Union. The catalyst for Hitler's reversal was Stalin's occupation of northern Romania, a move that struck uncomfortably close to the vital oil field in Ploiesti. Recognizing the strategic importance of these oil reserves, Hitler felt compelled to act. He saw them as essential to sustaining the Axis powers' war effort, particularly in light of the Axis's dependence on oil for military operations. At that time, Stalin and the Soviet Union were producing a substantial volume of oil, totaling 182,000 barrels per day, far exceeding Germany's production capacity. Hitler recognized not only the disparity in oil production, but also the strategic threat posed by the Soviets' vast oil reserves scattered across the Union. This abundance of oil in Soviet hands posed a direct challenge to Hitler's vision, particularly his ambitious plans for the new revolutionary blitzkrieg tactics. Hitler understood that to effectively execute blitzkrieg warfare, Germany needed ample oil reserves to fuel its military operations. The disparity in oil production between Germany and the Soviet Union shows the urgency of securing additional oil resources. Hitler perceived the Soviets' oil abundance as a strategic disadvantage for Germany, heightening his determination to rectify this discrepancy through military action. The recognition of the Soviet Union's significant oil production and reserves further fueled Hitler's resolve to initiate Operation Barbarossa. By invading the Soviet Union, Hitler aimed not only to eliminate a perceived threat, but also to gain control over vital oil resources, essential for sustaining Germany's war machine and realizing his militaristic ambitions. Hitler's realization of the criticality of these oil fields was said by his candid admission to Mussolini: "The life of the Axis depends on those oil fields." This statement encapsulated the significance of oil resources not only for Germany but for the entire Axis alliance. Without access to sufficient oil, the Axis powers would struggle to maintain their military campaigns and sustain their war machinery. Thus, Operation Barbarossa was not merely a military campaign aimed at territorial expansion, it was also a strategic move driven by the imperative need for oil resources. This episode emphasizes the important role that oil played in shaping the dynamics of World War II and the alliances between major powers. Hitler's strategic objectives extended beyond merely securing oil resources. He specifically targeted the oil-rich region of the Caucasus, encompassing key locations such as Maikop, Grozny and Baku. Recognizing the critical importance of these oil fields, Hitler emphasized their significance in the broader context of the war effort. In a telling statement at the end of 1942, Hitler expressed the dire necessity of obtaining the Baku oil, declaring that unless we get the Baku oil, the war's lost. This acknowledgement was the important role that control over oil resources played in Hitler's wartime strategy. The conquest of Baku and its surrounding oil fields represented a strategic imperative for Nazi Germany. Even Rommel's campaign in North Africa was seen as part of a larger pincer movement aimed at converging on Baku. This demonstrates the strategic integration of various military operations within Hitler's overarching plan to seize control of vital oil reserves. The significance attached to the Caucasus oil fields highlights the centrality of oil in shaping the course of World War II. Germany's initial blitzkrieg tactics proved highly effective, enabling them to seize vast territories and capture substantial fuel supplies, often exceeding their own consumption needs. However, their successes faltered during their eastward offensives, encountering significant challenges with supply logistics. A critical factor contributing to these logistical challenges was the disparity in fuel types used by German and Soviet tanks. While German panzers relied on gasoline, Soviet tanks operated on diesel. This discrepancy created logistical complexities, particularly as German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory. Maintaining long supply lines to sustain the advancing armies became increasingly difficult, exacerbating logistical strains. The culmination of these challenges manifested in the major Battle of Stalingrad, which marked Germany's first significant setback in Europe during 1942-43. The protracted battle and eventual defeat at Stalingrad were the limitations of Germany's military capabilities, particularly in terms of sustaining large-scale offensives over vast distances. Stalingrad represented a turning point, signalling the beginning of a shift in momentum on the Eastern Front and highlighting the massive challenges in oil and inherent in waging war against the Soviet Union. Germany's most significant achievement lay in the production of synthetic fuels. By 1941, production had reached an unprecedented rate of 31 million barrels per year, equivalent to approximately 85,000 barrels per day, which still is not enough. This output peaked in 1943 before facing a decline due to bombing raids targeting synthetic fuel production plants. By the end of 1943, Germany was producing approximately 62 million barrels per year. While these figures may seem impressive, they pale in comparison to the United States production levels. Despite being in the midst of a world war, the United States was producing up to 4 million barrels per day by 1943, far surpassing Germany's output. However, when discussing fuel production, quality is a crucial factor. While the United States could afford to manufacture high-quality 100-octane gasoline, Germany had to settle for 87-octane gasoline. This difference in fuel quality had significant implications. Higher octane gasoline allows for greater engine performance, particularly in combat or aviation applications. The lower quality gasoline produced by Germany undoubtedly affected the performance of its engines, limiting their efficiency and overall effectiveness in military operations. To provide further context, let's delve deeper into the implications of these staggering fuel consumption figures within the broader logistical framework of the German military during Operation Barbarossa. The estimated fuel consumption of 450,000 barrels for the 20 armoured divisions participating in Operation Barbarossa is a striking figure, emphasising the enormous logistical demands of modern mechanised warfare. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's essential to recognise that these calculations only account for a portion of the fuel usage within the German military. In addition to the armoured divisions, other units such as motorised and infantry divisions also required significant fuel supplies to sustain their operations. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, as well as various support units, relied heavily on fuel for their aircraft, ships, vehicles and equipment. The entire German truck logistics system, responsible for transporting troops, supplies and equipment across vast distances, also contributed to the overall fuel consumption. Contrary to the popular perception propagated by wartime propaganda, which depicted the German army as highly mechanized and reliant solely on motorized and armored divisions, the reality was more nuanced. While these divisions played a crucial role, the German military still heavily relied on traditional transportation methods, including horse-drawn wagons and carts. In fact, up to 70% of German transportation during World War II depended on horses. Each infantry division was typically assigned thousands of horses, which were indispensable for transporting heavy equipment, ammunition and supplies across rugged terrain, especially in areas where mechanized vehicles struggled to operate effectively. Fuel shortages posed significant challenges for the German forces in North Africa, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel famously remarked that his tactics were often dictated more by the level of fuel in his tanks than by tactical considerations. Rommel's correspondence with his wife revealed the extent of his anxiety, as he described recurring nightmares of his forces running out of fuel on the battlefield. In a bid to mitigate the impact of fuel shortages and maintain a facade of strength, Rommel resorted to unconventional tactics. One notable strategy involved the fabrication of dummy tanks at workshops in Tripoli. These dummy tanks were constructed using lightweight materials and mounted on fuel-efficient Volkswagen chassis, presenting a deceptive image of greater tank numbers to adversaries. This innovative approach not only aimed to deceive the enemy, but also reflected the resourcefulness and adaptability of German forces in the face of logistical constraints. Despite the challenges posed by fuel shortages, Rommel's ingenuity and strategic acumen enabled him to sustain the momentum of the North African campaign, albeit against formidable odds with fuel shortages.
Fuel has become more precious than gold. Every drop counts, and every gallon is fought over tooth and nail. And here in Ukraine, in the heart of this brutal war, the shortage hits us harder than most. It's affecting everyone, from the foot soldiers trudging through the snow to the mighty tanks that once rolled across the fields with impunity. I remember when our supply lines were strong, when we never had to worry about running out of fuel. But those days are long gone. Now we're forced to ration every last drop, to make every gallon stretch as far as it can go. And even then, it's not enough. Just yesterday, I watched as a convoy of trucks limped into camp, their engines sputtering and coughing as they struggled to keep moving. Some of them had to be ditched by the roadside, their precious cargo of fuel too valuable to risk losing. It's a grim sight, seeing the pride of our army abandoned like that, left to rust and rot in the cold Ukrainian mud. But what choice do we have? We can't fight a war without fuel, can't hope to hold back the relentless tide of the enemy without the means to power our machines of war. And so we soldier on, doing the best we can with what little we have, praying that somehow, some way, we'll find a way to keep moving forward, even in the face of such overwhelming odds.
During the winter months, the Germans managed to amass significant reserves of fuel. However, as spring turned into summer, these reserves were rapidly depleted, a cycle that repeated year after year. Despite their ability to replenish reserves annually, the summer of 1944 marked a pivotal turning point. It was during this time that a series of events unfolded, particularly between May and September, precipitating a downward spiral. Allied bombing raids during this period crippled German fuel production, reducing it by a staggering 85%. The sheer brutality of these airstrikes is exemplified by the onslaught on May 12th, which saw the utilization of over 900 bombers. This single attack left approximately half of the targeted plants damaged, illustrating the magnitude of destruction. The aftermath of this air raid was so severe that even Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments himself, conceded that the tide of the technological war had turned against Germany that day. Despite some minimal recovery efforts by certain synthetic fuel plants by the end of 1944, overall fuel production continued to plummet. The situation was further exacerbated by the fall of Romania into the hands of the Soviet Union in August 1944. This dual onslaught, both in terms of physical destruction and loss of critical resources, dealt a severe blow to Germany's ability to sustain its war effort, marking a critical juncture in the conflict. The cessation of vital fuel shipments from the Romanian oil wells added another layer of complexity to the unfolding events. This interruption in supply created a stark paradox. Despite reaching peak industrial production in 1944, Germany found itself grappling with a severe shortage of fuel, rendering its industries unable to operate at optimal capacity, let alone half capacity. This discrepancy between industrial output and available fuel exacerbated the situation, leading to the formation of negative feedback loops. The interplay of these factors created a vicious cycle wherein the shortage of fuel hampered industrial operations, thereby impeding the production of essential materials and equipment needed to sustain the war effort. Consequently, the inability to fully utilize its industrial potential further strained Germany's already dwindling resources, exacerbating the fuel crisis and perpetuating a downward spiral. As September of 1944 unfolded, Germany's synthetic fuel output plummeted to a mere 5,000 barrels per day kilobit per second, a stark contrast to the levels necessary to sustain the war effort. This precipitous decline in fuel production posed insurmountable challenges for the German war machine, rendering air operations virtually impossible and severely hindering the mobility of ground forces. In the final, desperate weeks of the war, the scarcity of fuel became acute. Despite the urgent need for mobility and flexibility in the face of advancing Allied forces, German divisions remained immobilized, their tanks and aircraft sitting idle due to lack of fuel. Hitler, ensconced in his bunker, continued to issue directives and command strategies, seemingly oblivious to the logistical catastrophe unfolding outside. As the conflict drew to a close, the scarcity of fuel reached crisis levels. In a poignant symbol of the dire situation, German army trucks, once the backbone of logistical support, were reduced to being towed by oxen, a stark reminder of the profound logistical breakdown and desperation gripping the German military in its final desperate hours. During the harrowing Battle of Berlin, one of the most poignant examples of Germany's fuel crisis unfolded. Despite the looming threat to the capital, many of the remaining armoured vehicles stationed around Berlin couldn't be deployed to defend the city, because there was a critical shortage of fuel rendered these formidable war machines immobile, effectively robbing Berlin of vital reinforcements precisely when they were needed most. As Allied forces closed in on the heart of Germany, the inability to mobilize armoured units due to fuel shortages underscored the extent of the logistical nightmare gripping the German military. This stark reality not only weakened Berlin's defences, but also symbolised the broader collapse of Germany's war machine in the face of overwhelming Allied advances. In the twilight of World War II in 1945, the Germans launched their final major offensive, known as Operation Spring Awakening. This desperate manoeuvre was aimed at securing the vital oil fields in Hungary, exacerbating the acute desperation for oil that had gripped Germany as Allied forces closed in from all fronts. Facing imminent defeat, the Germans resorted to this audacious offensive in a last-ditch effort to alleviate their critical fuel shortage. The importance of the oil fields in Hungary couldn't be overstated, as control over these resources could potentially provide a lifeline for Germany's dwindling war effort. also to potentially regain control over the oil fields of Romania. Despite calls from General Heinz Guderian and others to deploy the 6th Panzer Army to protect Berlin and northern Germany, Hitler insisted on focusing efforts on protecting the oil resources. The German-controlled oil fields around Nagikanica in southern Hungary were particularly crucial, especially with Allied air attacks disrupting synthetic gasoline production sites at this time. Despite ongoing withdrawals and shifting circumstances, General Wöhler initially planned to attack east. Over 7 weeks later, the surviving soldiers of these elite corps would become prisoners of war, but not to the Soviets, to the Americans. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender, two major figures in the conflict, Stalin and Churchill, offered contrasting perspectives on the decisive factors in the war. Stalin emphasized the critical role of machinery and fuel, stating that the outcome was determined by engines and octane. On the other hand, Churchill said the significance of gasoline, asserting that it wielded unparalleled control over military operations. Reflecting on this stark divergence, one can't help but ponder the profound discrepancy in the availability and quality of fuel between the opposing sides. In the grand scheme of World War II, Germany's struggle with fuel supply emerged as a colossal impediment, ultimately proving catastrophic for their military endeavours. Iconic battles like Stalingrad and Kursk stood as pivotal moments where the scarcity of fuel manifested in tangible setbacks. Particularly notable was the malfunction of the advanced New Panthers, directly attributable to the inferior quality of the fuel they were forced to utilise. While historical narratives often emphasise Germany's defeat stemming from factors like overextension and the harsh Russian winter, it's imperative to recognise the profound impact of Germany's fuel crisis. This deficiency severely compromised the operational readiness of the German war machine, revealing a fundamental lack of preparedness for the monumental challenges they faced. Confronted with the sheer might of behemoths like the United States and the Soviet Union, Germany found itself outmatched in the critical battleground of industrial capacity and fuel resources. Despite the initial success of their blitzkrieg tactics, which revolutionized warfare in the early stages of the conflict, engaging in prolonged hostilities with global superpowers proved untenable. Ultimately, the war transformed into a relentless struggle for control over oil resources, where every drop of oil became synonymous with the blood spilt on the battlefield. In this pivotal war of metal and fuel, Germany faced insurmountable odds, unable to sustain its military ambitions in the face of adversaries wielding superior industrial might and resource abundance. It's an intriguing question to ponder. Germany's fuel shortage was indeed a significant handicap that severely hindered its military operations during World War II. However, whether Germany could have overcome this challenge is debatable. Some argue that Germany's fuel issues were deeply ingrained in structural deficiencies within its economy and resource management. These issues were exacerbated by the Allied bombing campaigns, which targeted key industrial and oil production facilities. Given these circumstances, it's challenging to envision a scenario where Germany could have sufficiently addressed its fuel shortage in time to alter the course of the war significantly. However, others suggest that with different strategic decisions, such as prioritising synthetic fuel production earlier in the war or securing alternative sources of oil through diplomatic means, Germany might have mitigated the impact of its fuel crisis to some extent. Ultimately, while it's tempting to speculate on what might have been, the complex interplay of political, economic and military factors makes it difficult to definitively assert whether Germany could have effectively addressed its fuel shortage and changed the outcome of the war. Before we wrap up, I'm eager to hear your perspective. Could Germany have found a solution to its fuel shortage during World War II, or was its fate sealed from the outset? Share your insights in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to know your thoughts, and I look forward to embarking on our next adventure together. Until then, take care and goodbye for now.